It's a session titled ADR as Critical Infrastructure in Africa's Critical Mineral Value Retention for Sustainable Development. And here we explore how effective ADR mechanisms can support value retention, investment, stability, and long-term development. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage our moderator for this section, Director and Head of Industrialization, Manufacturing and Trade Sector for CDH, Jackwell Feris, as well as Advocate Davy Malungisi, Kossi Toulassi, and Justice David Unterhalter. Please give them a very warm round of applause.
Good morning, everyone. It's me again for the third day.
What's sitting?
Hopefully you're all well, and thanks for all who could make it after yesterday's gala dinner. So you can see at least we have, I think, a decent crowd. We were budgeting for a few people because of yesterday. But thank you again. So as the MC introduced, so today, the first session for today, on the last day of JAW, we are discussing the topic ADR as critical infrastructure in Africa's critical mineral value retention for sustainable development. So the program has changed slightly, and I'm joined by three esteemed guests. Just to briefly introduce each of the guests. Firstly, Justice David Unterhalter from the Supreme Court of Appeal. I think everyone heard from Justice Unterhalter yesterday, so no further introduction, I think, is required. We all know Justice Unterhalter. Then joining me also is Mr. Kossi Toulassi. He is the head of Industrialization, Trade, Market Economic Analysis for the African Union Development Agency, going to set some policy scene for us from an AU perspective, what is happening and what should be done. And then also joining us is Advocate Davy Malungisi from he is a special advisor for the Southern African Resource Watch, and standing in for Dr. Claude Kabemba. On short notice, he said, I must say, because he had to prepare literally last night. So, but he knows he's an expert in the field. So I think it's important and prudent that having regard to our discussion this week on fragmentation in the global order, and in particular yesterday, the session, at one of the breakaway sessions 4, we also spoke broadly about critical minerals, supply chains, but from an energy transition perspective also. And in those sessions, or in that session, we had certain urgent questions that also came up, which is part of our discussion today. How are critical mineral disputes playing out in the new geopolitical battleground? The discussion showed supply chain fragmentation, export restrictions, and strategic competitions are generating a new category of disputes. One sitting on the intersection of investment law, trade law, and geopolitical rivalry. That was the dispute lens. What happens what happens when something goes wrong? This morning's session asks the prior question, and in many ways the more important one. What institutional, legal, and industrial architecture does Africa need so that the conditions giving rise to those disputes are addressed before parties ever reach a tribunal? If yesterday was about what happens and when the relationships breaks down, today is about what must be built so that Africa's position in that relationship is fundamentally stronger, so that the conditions under which contracts invests and participants in the global mineral economy are ones that retains the value chain. And yesterday we were talking about, fundamentally when we talk about the AFCFTA, it's about retaining the value in the continent. There's a fundamental recognition, having regard to the blueprint, which AFCFTA, that we need to ensure value addition on the African continent because of what is, our inter-Africa trade is less than if we compare to any other region. Now, from a geopolitical perspective, we are living through a profound reorganization of the global economy around critical minerals. Every major power has concluded, and these minerals are so strategic that it cannot be left to the open markets to determine. The United States has imposed sweeping tariffs and launched mineral partnership agreements designed to lock supply chains to Western allies. China, which dominates the refining and processing of nearly 19 of 20 most critical minerals globally, has responded by restricting exports of rare earths and processing technologies, reminding the world that controlling the downstream is as important as controlling the ground. The European Union has enacted its Critical Raw Materials Act, setting domestic processing targets on terms that serve European industrial policy. At Johannesburg Summit last year, the G20 produced a document called the Critical Minerals Framework that reframed these minerals as drivers for inclusive growth and sustainable development, giving Africa and African states genuine political cover to demand beneficiation at the source and a larger share of the value chain, the beneficiation. But here's the tension. The same G20 endorsed framework that contains the United States, whose Project Vault strategy prioritizes security of supply for Western gigafactories over broad-based African industrialization. The framework is voluntary and non-binding. The supply chain deals are not. And then there is the China dilemma. South Africa's framework agreement on economic partnership with China targets duty-free access for mining and green technology exports. But if China already dominates global refining and processing infrastructure in Africa is not yet in place, zero tariff access may simply make it cheaper to export raw materials or raw ore. Precisely the opposite of our beneficiation policies on the continent. African states are navigating a moment in which they cannot afford to choose sides, but were refusing to choose sides has its own risks. So the political ambitions is multi-aligned. The legal and institutional architecture has not kept pace with that transition. So having said all of that, I think looking at the political will and legal architecture and the discussion today, so ADR reform without industrial policy reform, without contractual reform, and without genuine governance accountability will simply relocate where disputes are heard without changing who benefits. This dialogue seeks to reposition arbitration as an instrument of value retention, development finance, and green justice, and to advance the establishment of an institutionalized critical mineral dispute resolution framework in Africa, administered by competent African institutions like AFSA. So as I mentioned, I'm joined by an esteemed panel, and I'm going to start from the high-level policy perspective of what is happening on the African continent. And my first question goes to Kossi. Kossi, you've prepared a concept note, and your position is quite clear and compelling in respect of the strong African project pipeline, the strong Africa's position in contracting, negotiation and dispute management, the extractive industrial hubs. What is your position in terms of how can Africa ensure that using dispute settlement as a framework, that is part of the architecture to ensure that we actually maintain the minerals here, the beneficiation here, and ultimately also resolve the disputes as part of those entire value chain? If you can just update us for us.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the AFSA management for inviting NEPAD to this important week. It's well positioned in terms of the geopolitics where we are traversing now. 3 points. With regard to AUDA-NEPAD, African Union is clear in terms of their strategy, what we want to do. Starting with the normative framework that we have, the like of AIDA, Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa, AFSA that you mentioned, and PIDA, which is in charge of infrastructure. Mineral in Africa, by design, was to serve other continents, not for the benefit of Africans. And we all know that. I'm not going to go to the history of that. What we have done, I would say since 2009, through the African Mineral Vision, through the AMDC, which is the African Mineral Development Center, and then through the transformation of NEPAD into African Union Development, with the mandate that we have from our member state, head of government, to ensure that the resources, the mineral resources, are transformed for the benefit of Africans. So we took that as a role of African Union Development Agency to take the policies, decisions of African member states, transform them into very pragmatic, implementable program and project. So the past 3 years, what we did with the assistance of African Development Bank, African Union Commissions, African UNECA, which is the Economic Commission from United States, Economic Commission for, what do you call it? For Africa, for the United Nations, and other institutions like Africa Change Lab, and most of them, the civil society, is to understand and come up with a program that addresses the challenges that you just mentioned, particularly in terms of how Africa benefit from its mineral resources. So we have developed 5 pillars that address those issues. I will go through them quickly and to demonstrate to the audience that African Union has taken responsibility to ensure that African countries, and particularly institutions like AFSA here, play the critical role. And I will conclude with that by demonstrating why we need AFSA. Why do we need to partner with institutions like AFSA? First of all, the program is based on 5 tenets, as I mentioned. The first one is a capacity strengthening of African member states. That includes the geoscience, the legal aspect, and that's why I'm here today, and to ensure that we understand contracting, we understand geoscience. How do we support our experts in the geological science, and also the government, particularly with regard to contracting, where some of the elements like arbitration texts are missing, and that causes a lot of problems. And you can see across the continent that contracts have been renegotiated for lack of a simple thing like arbitration clauses that are not there. How do we ensure that we take responsibility and implement those to strengthen those capacity? Second, across the continent, you have artisanal mining enterprises. if you disaggregate that, you will see about 80% are women. The rest, 20%, are around the youth. But up to today, there's no mechanism to ensure that those 80% are looked after. Through simple mechanisms that we've put in place. First, we create financial mechanisms whereby they will be able to, one, have the resources, which is not a grant, because I don't believe in grants, to ensure that they have a financial mechanism whereby they can take a loan through commercial bank. And we are creating that facility to the tune to start with a $20 million. It's a small, but it's a very important step toward the right direction. We're looking also into, after you capacitated the institution, the ASME, you need now to talk about industrialization hub. How do we create that? Through the current corridor that we have. For instance, Lobido corridor, the corridor, Lagos-Abidjan corridor. Why are we doing that? Because they have already the infrastructure in place. They have the energy requirement, or are building those energy requirements. The secure logistical aspect is very important if you want to move from just extraction to transformation. That's what we are focusing on that. Now, after you've done that, it's important to look into the logical process whereby you need mine to be de-risked. That's what we're looking at, de-risking the brownfield mine as well as the greenfield mine. And all the members there are involved into that. At the end of the day, we'll have a portfolio of investable projects into class of assets so that ordinary African can invest into those class of assets and making the economic transformation that we are looking for. And also inviting the global players. Lastly, having that order, you need research and development. Research and development, particularly in the iron battery sector that everybody is venturing into, and center of researches and excellences that we are looking into across the continent. So the question is, why am I here today? I'm here because I believe in arbitration. And without arbitration, it's difficult to ensure that you can have a trusted investor coming to the continent, as well as our local African investors, so that when there's a disagreement, we can come to AFSA in South Africa instead of flying out of the continent. And they have well-equipped system to be able to deal with that. So it's important that in drafting the contract, the arbitration clause are there. That's why we want to partner, ensuring that when we do the capacity strengthening, when we contract, when we develop and de-risk all the mine that we plan to do every year between 5 to 10, that the legal aspect is taken care of. I will stop there for now, and I will elaborate further. Thank you.
Thank you, Kossi. I think it's maybe important to just bring the justice in at this particular point before I come back to just on, you spoke about the importance of arbitration and institution, but we also on the continent have this dilemma in respect of some states are pro-arbitration, some states are not pro-arbitration, like in our own country has a particular view in respect of arbitration. So how do we get justice, having regard to what's happening in the world of BITs, whether it's capital exporting jurisdictions with a specific, more onerous guarantee provisions and the reference to exit arbitrations and so on, and then you get it from an African perspective, and you look at the AFCFTA protocol, and you see, yes, there's guarantees, but there's actually a dispute, even with the African states, about should we have arbitration or not.
Yes, so there's obviously a huge opportunity for Africa that arises from the geopolitical competition over critical minerals. And the question is, how do African countries and Africa at large benefit maximally from that competition? I think one does need to go back to some basics around this, which is that one has to reduce the cost of capital to those who are likely investors in critical minerals and those who might be interested in beneficiation. And the cost of capital is directly related to regulatory risk. So one needs to, I think, come back to some of the essential features, which is firstly that if there is regulatory predictability and there is consistency of application across jurisdictions as to how minerals and rights are actually given and exploited, that is a very big part of the picture. And one must never forget that aspect, because it's the critical flaw from which proper investment takes place. But I think it is also worth reflecting that there is understandable concern that the history of bilateral investment treaties often is treated with some measure of skepticism because of what is perceived to be two things. One, the inconsistent treatment of the standards under those treaties, and secondly, what is seen to be regulatory constraint upon what African jurisdictions would seek to do. Now, there are not simple answers to those problems, and we can perhaps expand upon them. But I don't think that in respect of attracting capital and beneficiation in Africa, that without a framework of investment protection internationally, one is likely to mitigate some of the difficulties that African jurisdictions have had. That's the first thing. And in respect of intra-Africa investment, and perhaps we can come on to this in more detail, while there are some interesting features of the protocol, I think that the failure to have properly enforceable standards is actually just a mistake. The fact is that investors, firstly, look to those protections for the purposes of having enforceable guarantees that can be adjudicated and enforced, and if you don't have that, the best will in the world around mediation and grievance procedures and the like are never going to suffice, and one simply has to be realistic about this. And the second thing, just to take account of, is that there is a very real risk of circumvention. I mean, the protocol is intended to cover treaty parties within Africa, but capital is highly mobile, and if the protections aren't adequate and the enforcement procedures aren't sufficient, capital will simply move to where there are greater investment protections under other kinds of BIT arrangements. And so I think if Africa is going to seriously look at this, the skepticism about enforceable standards under the protocol really needs to be revisited, notwithstanding the historical skepticism that is often launched at these questions.
Yeah. No, thanks, Justice. And reasonably, we had a particular sequence, but I think just on that particular point, it was important because we, as part of the debate and developing the broader framework based on the 5 pillars on the industrialization of Africa and using critical minerals as a catalyst, we have to accept, and I think everyone on the panel accepts this, that dispute settlement is a fundamental component of that effective enforcement of a adjudicative body's decision in respect of a deadlock. And as Justice has said, mediation, yes, it's great, mediation and negotiations works in certain instances, and those are typically dubbed the African way of resolving disputes. But in other instances where you want to attract capital, you actually have to have credible institutions, like AFSA, credible seats like Johannesburg, Nairobi, Cairo, and so on. So all of those things, going back to you, Kossi, in respect of just the strategy and the 5 pillars, so how does that fit into the investment framework? In particular, also looking at, let's say, public-private partnerships to help these things get materialized, because you've mentioned the Liberia corridor. That's basically a public-private partnership. Getting the ore from the DRC through Angola to the port and export it. But if we don't have the private sector input and we can't give the private sector the comfort, how will that operate? And maybe just from a policy perspective, what the AU is thinking of, because we have this fragmentation on the African continent also.
Thank you. From the perspective of African Union, particularly with the work that we are doing in AUDA-NEPAD, we're looking into changing some of the mechanisms that we have. Now, to invest in mine, you need, like you say, a platform, a trusted and respected platform. The composition of the platform depends on the solidity of some of the institutions in the continent. So what we are advocating is that we have institutional investor-public partnership, which implies that the investment will be around some of the strong institutions like a pension fund, sovereign fund, and other banking system that we have, and also the private. And then you have some sort of like the strong purpose vehicle that managed. What it does now is that you have a place whereby every African can invest into, because it's a portfolio of projects between 5 to 10, sometimes beyond that, that are investable, having gone through all the processes to ensure that it's de-risk, return on investment is higher, above 18%, and the perceived risks like security, trust, and other are addressed. Having done that, then you have a platform that enables for investment. So we are looking into that, and we are in the process of implementing that, and also looking into what we call African Mining Industrialization Asset Class Platform that's linked to that. So that at the end of the day, what you have is a system that is working, where projects are de-risked, where you can invest into that. Why we're doing that? Because we are translating the policies that we have in the African Union. I talk about African Mineral Vision, African Green Mineral Strategy that has been approved, I think, a year ago, and also Agenda 2063. That tells us that we have to be economically independent, and that industrialization has to start with what we have in terms of critical mineral, in terms of transforming that into green industrialization. Those will not happen if this mechanism of funding them are not in place. That's what we are advocating for, a change in the approach that we have. Investing in single mine requires more effort than investing in 10 to 15 asset class that transform the landscape and giving trust. And when you are talking about 500 million, we are talking about 100 billion to $1 trillion asset. That changed the discussion, and that also create an ecosystem whereby more investors are interested in, because the risk is spread over a number of assets that are within that. So that's what we are looking to. Thank you.
Thank you. Then just moving to Advocate Mkhululi, touching on what the vision is from an institutionalization perspective, but now taking it to the grassroots, to the people on the ground who see the mines, see the exploration happening next door to them, the communities. And some of the most fundamental disputes sometimes happen as a consequence of what happens at the grassroots level. So in terms of your organization, how do you assist and facilitate that those communities also are part of the discussion? And when disputes arise on a community level, community unrest, saying, and I've been in incidents where mines are blocked and you help clients and communities saying, this is our minerals, where are you taking it? So how do you resolve those type of things? Because it ultimately trickles up also then to government, and it becomes a potential investor-state dispute as a consequence of not complying with certain community obligations.
Yeah, thank you. I'm coming from the Southern Africa Resource Watch, so most of our work, we are working with the communities. And the critical minerals emergency has created a rush. a rush that risks shortcuts to investment decision, to permitting systems. We've seen government processes shortchanged in terms of stakeholder engagement and participation. But from an investment point of view, we have to discuss this in the context of sustainability. Sustainability practices that are taking the form of ESGs, environmental, social governance. So we need to view community participation mainly from a value chain governance angle. And how are we beginning to discuss complaints at local level? It's in this way. We have not seen a change of the type of complaints from previous extractive or mining regimes to what we have right now. People are complaining about low compensation, lack of sufficient consultation in terms of resettlement plans, and many other elements that have constituted complaints even now under this regime of critical minerals emergence. So if you go to the standards, you'll see that ESG investing operates based on standards, and that informs even the financial asset managers, the banks, and so forth. So to that extent, there are standards like the Equator Principles. That's part of soft law. Equator Principles, they insist that you must have a grievance redress mechanism as part of your due diligence, including human rights due diligence. The point is there are risks associated with lack of legitimacy or what is called social license to operate. If indigenous people who sit or under their land, there's these minerals. So if they have grievances and they don't give what is called in international human rights law, free, prior, and informed consent, then it generates risks of maybe project delays. So from a financier, from an investor, they want guarantee of stability, that they are not going to be challenged in courts and so forth. So our work is seen that what we need to do, if you look at the Africa's green mineral strategy, pillar number 4 is actually about safeguarding ESGs, economic, social, and governance rights. So to that extent, it means our role as civil society is to assist the communities to understand the mechanisms that are available. And at that level, what we have done in countries such as DRC, Zimbabwe, and others, we have worked with communities to engage with the companies so that they co-design grievance redress mechanisms. And those mechanisms, then it means, as we are seeing, they are moving away from just being corporate social responsibility mechanisms to some governance requirement that I think must even move to regulation. I know in trade terms, some are saying that may constitute a technical barrier to trade. So we are clearly working with communities, and we really want to strengthen that there must be independence of those mechanisms. There must also not be retaliation. There must be guarantee that if you raise a complaint, there's no retaliation from the corporations. And we're looking at all those aspects. And I'll come to maybe what does that mean in terms of green justice when we discuss the next question.
I think that's very importantly. There's several examples on the continent where things have gone horribly wrong in respect of environmental impact on communities. One of the examples, probably the most recent, is in Zambia, where the retention dam burst, polluted an entire river. So all of those social impacts, and again, the communities feel it because they're next to it. Their livelihoods are impacted. And so I think on that point, it's also so, although it seems like it's a community issue, but actually it's an investment issue, because if governments, again, and the investor don't negotiate the proper agreements and ensure that investors, firstly, they obviously need to comply with the regulatory requirements and do all the reporting and so on. But the investment agreements are important to regulate these things also. And that's maybe, again, back to Justice, is that I think we talk about old generation BITs, and we have, most of them is typically the export capital jurisdictions, the European countries, the US and so on, into Africa. But then on the continent, and the UN has been busy with the new framework in terms of you can't just have one-sided way of investors invoking rights and suing governments for FET, expropriation and so on. There must be a two-way street where governments can also sue an investor for breaching ESG obligations and so on. Do you think our framework on the continent is fit for purpose as it stands?
Well, I think there are two things. The first is one needs to see where the sources of investment come from, and where, as I've indicated, one can have a meaningful impact on the flow of investment and the risks attached to it. I think that our experience shows that in the generations of BITs that have been concluded over a large number of years, there are undoubtedly questions as to how the standards, which are very generally framed, have been applied, and where the consistency is, and what is the balance between investor rights and the regulatory competences of states that should be retained. And we have seen that one of the responses is to try and conceive of a set of appellate jurisdictions that would give rise to greater consistency in respect of, let's call them the older regime of BITs. I think there's also much scope for trying to renegotiate some of those to perhaps update the standards and think more about more reciprocal bilateral kinds of rights and obligations as between states and investors. But that's a long and complex project, and again is somewhat resistant to what would be the quickest route, which would be a supranational effort to regulate investment either through a body like the WTO or the like. But those kinds of really ambitious schemes are simply, I think, beyond us in the world that we face at the moment. On the inter-Africa investment and what is being done under the Africa Free Trade Agreement, I mean, there are clearly some important efforts to refine the standards, particularly in relation to FET and the concern around legitimate expectations, to try and, as it were, constrain the potential scheme of expectations that have sometimes been thought to derail regulatory interests that states have. My own concern here is that you have to balance up whether the refined standards that you are seeking to put in place and the reciprocal nature of them, what is it actually going to do by way of guaranteeing capital and risk? You have to take a realistic view of it, because you can have beautifully framed agreements, but if they are not actually going to make the difference to the protection of investment that you want to encourage, well, we don't yet know whether they will be adequate, and there are reasons to think that to some degree the established standards and some of the jurisprudence that surrounds the existing BIT standards may be more predictable than creating new standards which are untried and untested. But we'd have to see how it works in practice. The only way to make sure that you can really test these standards is, as I've already indicated, my skepticism that under the difficulties that are now being negotiated around enforcement, I really think that without proper enforceable standards through dispute resolution that is actually going to permit of awards that actually compensate for risk. I think that you can have the best and most refined standards, but you simply won't get the result. And I fear that that nettle is simply not being grasped in the protocol and the debates that are taking place around it.
No, thank you, Justice. I think, and that is, I think, fundamentally the big issue is the enforceability. We can't have a dispute settlement mechanism where we don't, in particular, have arbitration, whether it's investor-state arbitration, but in particular arbitration as a dispute settlement mechanism that is enforceable against the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that one could certainly do is have quite important mediation requirements. Correct. So that you try to minimize the number of cases that go through to adversarial adjudication. And you can also create a variety of mechanisms to speed up those mechanisms and think about how the arbitration process will work. Perhaps there should be panels of arbitrators and mechanisms for trying to secure consistency and the like, so as to prevent some of the uncertainty that can attach to BIT litigation. But those are all ranges of options within the scheme of enforceable standards. Yes. They're not about saying, well, you know, there's a different way of enforcing standards where actually in relationships between states and investors, they will somehow find common ground. They often don't, and for very good reasons, and there are real disputes and they need to be resolved. And if you don't have a predictable system for doing it, as I say, you do raise the cost of capital and you reduce your competitive attractiveness, and neither of those are outcomes we want.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Justice. Then just, Mr. Toulassi, going maybe just back to you, and it touches again on the point, and I'm going to go back to Advocate Mkhululi, is so looking at what we've spoken about, so from a NEPAD or African Development Agency perspective, the AFCFT investment protocol has, again, so we have the broader AFCFT framework, but the specific protocol, it's adopted, not yet enforced, because a number of other countries still need to ratify it. Annex is still being negotiated. The protocol itself has a lot of laudable specific guarantees, which tries and gets us to a bit more middle ground in terms of ESG, human rights, climate change, and all of these commitments, and energy transition. What is the African Development Agency also doing in parallel with the AFCFTA Secretariat to ensure that these discussions where, yes, mediation, great, it is in there, but we need to have, as the Justice, a predictable, enforceable system where if there's a deadlock in respect of, did I actually breach the ESG obligations or not, and we try and mediate, but there's still an impasse. Is there engagement on that level to make sure that we actually get to a process where by the end of this year, hopefully, we have an annex?
From the perspective of African Union Development Agency, we are not that strong in terms of litigation and those. But what we are strong in is to speak to government in terms of processes and mechanisms that are in place. And for me, being here today is we will be speaking about a partnership with AFSA in terms of how do we see the role of AFSA across the continent and how we are able to let know and advocate for litigation and also arbitration clause within the contract to avoid the future, in the future those situations that are unpleasant for investors to come in. So right now, in that process, what we're looking into, of course, we have the legal counsel that are also advising some of the issues, but we need a dedicated institution like AFSA, and that's what we are working on. So it's very important to say that we are not idle in terms of issues that currently we have in terms of litigation, in terms of dispute, in terms of how to build trust with investors and other partners, looking from the perspective of intervening at the government level, because we have access of all the 55 countries to be politically correct. The legal system that are in those countries, and importantly, how do we ensure that we strengthen the capacity through advocacy, through proper training, and supporting them financial to create that system that will enable them to be able to, I'll call it, better solve those issues in terms of legal difficulty, challenges that they have. So we work with the government, we work with institutions, and we are bringing them together, and so that we create an ecosystem that is legally robust, so that investors can come. When there's dispute, we can be able to solve those disputes. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's very important. So maybe just a last question, hopefully, Advocate Mkhululi, and then I'm going to go to Justice. But first to you. So if you have to, on behalf of the communities, and you live that on a daily basis, and you sitting next to the African Development Agency and say, okay, this is what I want to ensure is in the vision, in the plan, and in the engagement, so that you can ensure that that dispute that happens on the ground, actually, when it also happens there, it's actually dealt with on the top level. What would you say?
I would first say we have very nice documents at African Union level. Yes. And at national level, what we are seeing right now is that countries are developing national critical mineral strategies. And within them, they are also defining what ESGs and sustainability and circularity must be. So that alignment is important in terms of not documents only, but leadership. So that's the challenge we pose to our Pan-African institutions, to say there's need to demonstrate
on the ground
public leadership to implement what has been agreed.
We created policy, but the implementation is the
yes, and even this platform, the AFSA platform, is also to say we have seen a willingness to engage in terms of responsible sourcing practices. But we need to ensure that we disaggregate the investors, because Chinese investors' conduct is different from maybe an investor from Europe or so. So we are recommending that AFSA creates a deliberate, Chinese-facing. I know there's a China-Africa mechanism. If we can also incorporate grievance redress mechanisms and get evidence from communities to inform those processes, that is what I would say.
That's important.
Yes.
No, I think it's a social license to operate is critical.
Yes.
Then I think one of the last questions, and then each of you, maybe 30 seconds closing remark, but to the Justice. And it's a very important question because in the world we are living in, and so you were the chair of the WTO appellate body. You've seen how all of these things are happening. There's a sense of paralysis, it seems, on the WTO system, in particular the appellate body. So with all the changes globally, export restrictions by China, US tariffs being imposed at a whim, what is left of the system, and how do we as Africans actually then deal with this in the middle?
Well, this is a big topic, but let me try and pluck out a few important things. I think the first is that what's happened with the multilateral trading system is that there's been an inability to reach new comprehensive trade agreements under the auspices of the WTO. There has been the consequence of the trade imbalances within the system, which has given rise to quite significant geopolitical tensions, particularly as between the US and China. And then the results of COVID were to show supply chain vulnerabilities and The relationship to critical minerals is that in the aftermath of that and some of the geopolitical tensions in the world, there is now extraordinary attention being given to what an inability to have access to critical minerals and their processed outcomes can do to key industries that you have. So that's the backdrop. What can we do about it? Well, I think, one must hope that there are still possibilities for multilateral trade negotiations to succeed. But given certain of the geopolitical tensions, and particularly the US's disinclination to engage in multilateralism, I think what we need to recognize is that there are real opportunities for plurilateral and other kinds of agreements between willing blocks of countries, of which I was speaking briefly last night. But the key thing is this. If you think about the countries that are the sources of most demand for critical minerals, it is the US, it is the EU, it's China and Japan. They constitute the huge amount of demand for the minerals. Africa's strength lies in not only the plurality of critical minerals which exist on the continent, but if you can combine your negotiating strength through the AU and leverage that, then instead of negotiating country by country, you leverage your collective power over the continental endowment of critical minerals. But to do that, you have to think about how to engage in trade agreements Africa-wide with the key countries that are importing these minerals. So I think in one way we're just not being sufficiently ambitious, which is to look to countries like China and the EU, which are still very much engaged in not in the multilateral system, but in other kinds of free trade agreements, to think about how to leverage that power into advantageous trade agreements that are continent-wide and are concluded with countries, blocks like the EU, China and Japan. That, if you ask me, is the vision. What has happened, unfortunately, often with African trade negotiations is that they're looking for outcomes and benefits from a system that is now being replaced effectively. They're hoping to get benefits out of a multilateral kind of negotiation process that really is receding as a possibility for the future. And for so long as the African bloc continues to think about that as the payoff, we're going to not make the kind of progress for the continent that we need.
Thank you, Justice. So there needs to be a fundamental shift in the way we do trade.
Absolutely.
So maybe your final words. I know our time is up. Final words, 30 seconds each, please. What is your recommendation?
Well, I would make, I suppose, three fundamental recommendations, which is, as I said, the key is not simply to have fine pieces of paper that look and are framed in wonderful and ambitious terms, but actually consider the real mechanisms for making them workable and enforceable through predictable administration and regularity. And that requires a lot of domestic effort across jurisdictions of Africa. That's the first thing. The second is how to deal with corruption. I mean, it's one of the words that hasn't been much used, but part of what undermines the entire superstructure of improper investment protection is corruption, and how to deal with that through mechanisms that are going to be workable. And thirdly, if we're thinking continentally around the ambitions of the Africa Free Trade Agreement, pay attention to what it takes to attract capital and keep it, and the risks that are attendant upon it, and look at what is necessary to create enforceable mechanisms that are going to provide sufficient and predictable protection when one seeks to attract capital.
Thank you, Justice. Advocate Mkhululi.
Yeah, the first one is to support what Justice said, that even as civil society, we have proposed that a vanguard of producer countries should coalesce so that they can have a common position even within the African Continental Free Trade Area framework or the African Union. And that must be backed by civic understanding that this is a limited moment. these resources are going to finish, and Africa must approach with an agency. So the proposition is to say, can the African Union and Pan-African institutions declare critical minerals as a continental emergency and implement mechanisms to beneficiate, to negotiate, and take advantage of platforms such as the FOCAC, China, Africa, the EU conversations around critical minerals beneficiation and green sourcing, and all those should constitute a way that must give us beneficiation in the way it is framed in the African Union context, that it must be equitable, resource-based industrialization, and that must be a solution for localization and for special economic zones and other industrial zones to also promote relocation of production from other centers in the world to the African continent. And this is happening, that Zimbabwe has started exporting beneficiated lithium, and because of deliberate industrial policy and legal reforms that are taking place in Mozambique, they are also suggesting that there must be processing locally. But that can be a statement. You must also prepare for the supply side constraints that we face.
Thank you, Mr. Mkhululi. Then, Mr. Toulassi, you've now gotten all the recommendations. We're going to put that in a document to you for the AU. So your last words and all the recommendations you're going to implement.
Thank you. Our position is very simple. And for Africa to retain value from critical mineral, there are a few things that we need to do. First, dispute resolution, project preparation with all the mechanisms that I mentioned, beneficiation, and lastly, institutional capacity. All those need to be treated as one single strategy. So for us, Continental Extractive Industry Program is a strong starting point for us in terms of addressing all the input that and challenge that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for your time. We're done. Thank you. I don't know if you want to take a photo.
Of course you can do that. Thank you so much. One more round of applause for our moderator and panelists. Very insightful perspectives.